Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you, and an honor to be here with all of you for this evening's performance put on by the Origins Project. I should say I'm Lawrence Krauss. I'm the director of the Origins Project, and we are always very excited to see the response of the people here at the university and in the community to the programs we put on. And tonight's program is particularly fun, I hope. And about 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, Stanford University asked Richard and I if we'd go there and do a conversation. And it was going to be a moderated conversation. And Richard said, no moderator. And his point was well taken. He said, moderator always stops things when they get most interesting. So we tried it, and it worked. And we thought we'd try a conversation here tonight along those lines. So there will be no moderator, and the format will be as follows. We're going to have a conversation, a wide-ranging one, and we're not sure where it's going to go. And then after that, we'll take an intermission for people to calm down, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And again, that time period isn't yet fixed. It depends how interesting your questions are. And so that's the way it's going to go. And I now, of course, have the honor and privilege of introducing someone who needs no introduction. Richard Dawkins was the Charles Simonyi Chair in the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford, but he's also known throughout the world as one of the greatest writers about science living today, or perhaps who's ever lived. He has a following which is remarkable, and I can attest to that. 2 days ago we were walking around campus together, and I saw people fainting. People came up and shook and shook our hands and were nervous, and Richard produces that. I was going to say it was like walking around campus with Moses. But the difference is that I'm absolutely certain that Richard Dawkins exists. I actually, the first time I interacted with Richard was a one-way interaction. I had just written my first book, and my publishers had produced a short volume by Richard called River Out of Eden. And I wrote my very first fan letter to Richard. He didn't reply, but we've become good friends ever since, and it's my true honor to welcome to the stage Richard Dawkins. Thanks for coming, Richard, and I know everyone's here to see you, so that's okay. I've made some notes just in case, but we'll see where this goes. Now, the title for this evening is Something from Nothing, which sounds quite self-indulgent, since it's also the subtitle of my new book. But it's not completely for that reason. In fact, Something for Nothing goes, I think, and we think, beyond that. And I wanted to start, Richard, by asking you, sort of, in the context of evolution, what something from nothing means to you.
Charles Darwin solved one of the greatest riddles that the human mind has ever solved, which is how you get something from nothing, in the sense of how you get the immense complexity and diversity and beauty and elegance of life, and perhaps above all, how you get the powerful illusion of design that life shows, starting not quite from nothing, but starting from extreme simplicity. So before Darwin came along, it would have been extremely hard to believe that you could possibly explain how you get a human brain, a human eye, a horse's leg, a swift's wing, how you could get such beautiful and apparently elegantly designed things by purely the laws of physics acting out over a very long time from very simple beginnings. So getting something from nothing, Charles Darwin gives us all confidence. Charles Darwin showed that what must have seemed the most difficult problem of getting something from nothing was soluble. He solved it, and his successors have been simply fleshing out his explanation ever since. But after Darwin, it's no longer possible for anybody, any reasonable person, to say, oh, I simply can't believe you could get something so complicated as that.
So by reasonable person, you're not talking about the Republican candidates then, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. No, anyway, well, we'll try and offend as many people as we can tonight, but I think you're not being fair to Darwin. I think in a sense it's something from nothing. I mean, completely nothing. In the sense that every time take humans, we weren't around, perhaps more than maybe 5 to 10 million years ago. And so, in a sense, every time a new species is created, it's something from nothing.
Well, it's not from nothing because it's from an antecedent species, and even the evolutionary process, the process that Darwin discovered, didn't start from nothing. It had to start from, well, a reasonably complicated chemical beginning, which was the first self-replicating molecule. You can't, I mean, natural selection can't get going until you have genetics, and so you've got to have genetics. And that's not a trivial problem, and it's a problem that actually hasn't yet been solved.
Well, in fact, actually, that's kind of interesting, because it's true that many people think that evolution has to do with the origin of life, but it's really the origin of the diversity of life.
Yes.
And in fact, the famous final paragraph of his book, it basically tries to state that.
Yes. No, you have to start from a genetics, and that's one of the big gaps in our knowledge at the moment. Nobody knows how that started. The laws of chemistry somehow had to give rise to a self-replicating molecule. Once you've got that, at least a sufficiently accurately self-replicating molecule, then evolution takes off. And then the whole of the panoply of life, the whole diversity of life, and things like you and me eventually come into existence. But you have got to start with a genetics, and that pushes it into the domain of chemistry. And then before that, before chemistry, we push back into the domain of physics, where you guys take over.
But let's keep pushing on that point, because at some point, I thought of this in the context of the universe, and we may talk about it in a while, but there was no life on Earth when it was created, and there was no life potentially for maybe a few 100 million years. But then there was life. And so there's the moment when you go from chemistry to biology. It seems to me at some point that for many people, in fact, when they talk about something from nothing again, especially those who feel that the something requires a creator, that the origin of life itself, that is the creation of something from nothing.
Yeah. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and we don't know when life began, but probably after about 500 million years. We're probably around about 4 billion years. For the next couple of billion years, there were nothing but bacteria. And then, so life that you couldn't see without a microscope. And then life started getting sort of big and interesting, really only about 500 million years ago, at the time of the Cambrian explosion. Biology, as I said, hands over to chemistry as we push back. Round about 4 billion years.
At that moment, which and it's clear we don't yet understand how that transition occurs. But it seems to me, if you wanted to think that moment is a perfect example of how the laws of nature can create something from nothing, namely life from non-life, which is a dramatic change.
It's a dramatic change, and it was the creation of genetics. That was the key point. The creation by the laws of chemistry of the first gene. And it probably wasn't DNA, by the way. It would have been something simpler than DNA. DNA has been called a high-tech replicator, a high-tech genetic molecule. So probably DNA had a forerunner, a sort of John the Baptist molecule.
Well, we'll get there. I think the question. So people could rightfully say, how would you respond? I suspect I know how, but how would you respond? So people say, look, we don't understand the origin of life on Earth, and therefore God must have done it.
Even theologians don't buy that. I mean, sophisticated theologians, but it's what they call the God of the gaps argument. It's pushing God into the few remaining gaps in our understanding. Before Darwin came along, the whole of life was one big gap, one gigantic gap, and now we're pushed back to the origin of life, this chemical event, and that is a gap which will be filled. Even if it isn't filled, it would be bad logic, bad science, bad philosophy to say, oh, I don't understand it, therefore God did it. I mean, that's a pathetically bad piece of arguing.
It's a lazy argument, certainly.
It's a lazy argument. It doesn't even explain anything, of course, because it leaves open explaining where God came from. And so, I mean, the beauty of what Darwin did was to show how you can get godlike things, I mean, complicated things like human brains, how you could get godlike things starting from almost nothing. So to suddenly re-import a godlike thing at the beginning of the process is just a cowardly evasion of scientific responsibility.
Okay, now let's see. How would you make it? Last time you were here, it was for one of our workshops on the origins of life, where we actually began to talk about the chemistry that might be responsible for not producing DNA but RNA, which is thought to be the precursor. And we're getting very close. Do you think in your lifetime we'll understand we'll get the transition from organic chemistry to biology?
I do think so. However, I would make what I think is quite an interesting point. I've made it before. It is possible that this event we're talking about, this chemical event, was an exceedingly improbable event. It's possible that since we think there are about 10 to the 22, you tell me, stars in the universe, some very, very high number of
about that.
Yeah. And many of them probably have planets. If you want to believe, as some people do, that life on this planet is unique, if you want to believe that we're alone in the universe, then what many people don't realize, if they believe that, is that that automatically commits you to the view that the origin of life was a quite staggeringly improbable event. That has to be true because the number of opportunities around the universe for life to have originated is so large. And what that would mean is that chemists who are trying to solve the riddle of the origin of life on this planet are totally and utterly wasting their time, because we don't want a plausible theory. What we're looking for is an implausible theory, if you want to believe that life originated only once. Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe that we're looking for an implausible theory, and that is tantamount to saying that I believe the universe is crawling with life. On the other hand, because that argument depends upon the sheer number of available planets, crawling with life could still mean there could be 1 billion independent origins of life, 1 billion islands of life out there, and yet they could be still incredibly rare, because 1 billion is a tiny number compared to the 10 to the 22.
Yeah, that's one of the things, of course, that where cosmology comes in, that one of the things that, but it relates to evolution too, because the thing that makes evolution so difficult for many people to appreciate, from my experience and I'm sure from yours, is that life has been around for a long time, and a human time scale is very short, and it's very difficult to imagine such long time scale. So even if rare events happen in the evolution of life, with 4.5 billion years, there's lots of time for many rare events to happen. Similarly, in the universe, the thing that people don't realize is that rare events happen all the time, because the universe is big and old. And the example I've used probably on this stage before, to me it's one of an amazing example of that is the reason we're here before life, the fact that as I've often written, that we're all stardust, that every atom in our body came from an exploding star, and the atoms in your left hand may have come from a different atom, from a different star than the atoms in your right hand, because during the Big Bang, the only elements that were made during the first moments of the Big Bang were hydrogen helium and a little bit of lithium. And lithium may be important for some people in this audience, but the really important stuff, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, was made in stars. And the only way it can get into your bodies is if the stars were kind enough to die so you would be born. And but stars die only about once per 100 years per galaxy. And so it seems like, how could that happen? And in fact, but nevertheless, in the age of our galaxy, 200 million stars have exploded. Yeah. And if you look with a telescope, or to get a very powerful telescope, go out to a dark spot outside Phoenix and look at a dime-sized hole in the sky with the most powerful telescopes we have today, you can see 100,000 galaxies in that little dark region of the sky. So rare events are happening all the time, and the same is true in a biological context. And I think it's that the fact that we live a brief 100 years or so, and that makes evolution so difficult for people to comprehend.
Our brains were sculpted by natural selection on the African plains to only perceive timescales of a very short order, of a few years, a few decades. Then, if you say that a star explodes once every 100 years or so in our galaxy, the number of centuries that our galaxy has been around is a very large number of centuries. And the number of centuries available for evolution to have taken place is extremely large. This is exactly as you say. One of the main reasons people don't understand evolution is that they cannot grasp the immensity of time that's been available. You sort of idiotic statements like, well, I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey give birth to a human. I've seriously heard people say that.
Oh yes, so have I. In fact, I was going to ask you exactly that. What do you say to people? I was testifying in Texas to try and keep evolution in the schools there, and a woman got up and said, my grandfather wasn't a monkey. I said to her, well, in your case, it's not so clear, but what do you say? I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings about what evolution is, and it's probably worth explicitly pointing out the fallacy of that. So why don't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it's mostly the sheer length of time that there's been around. People, many of them think that evolution is talking about monkeys giving birth to humans. They don't realize that it's 25 million years ago that we had a monkey for an ancestor.
That we have a common ancestor with monkeys. It's not as if...
Well,
and then people would say, why are there monkeys today if evolution happened?
Yeah, and that displays a kind of arrogance that assumes that all that monkeys ever want to do is turn into humans.
Some of them go the other direction too, but I guess.
The point is, evolution is a constantly branching, diverging process. 25 million years ago, our ancestors might have looked like monkeys. They would have been the common ancestor of modern monkeys and modern humans and modern apes. We are, of course, apes. That would have been the common ancestor. If you'd been handed it, you probably would have called it a monkey. I mean, it would have been monkey-like, and you would have called it a monkey. So I suppose the main thing to get across to that idiotic woman that you described is that we are descended from common ancestors, and that monkeys are doing very nicely as they are, as monkeys. They've gone on branching and branching and branching, living in trees, doing all sorts of different things in trees, eating fruits, eating insects, eating leaves, doing monkey-like things extremely successfully. Apes we are actually apes, so we're not monkeys. We're apes because we're tailless, and the apes that we are cousins of are doing much less well, unfortunately, than the monkeys are. The apes that we're closest cousins of are chimpanzees and bonobos, equally close, by the way, to chimpanzees and bonobos, because they have a more recent common ancestor with each other than they have with us. However, we are chimpanzees would regard us as closer cousins to themselves than they would regard gorillas. So chimpanzees and humans are closer cousins of each other than chimpanzees are to gorillas, which surprises some people, but we are actually very close cousins of chimpanzees.
Well, you know, something just came up in my mind that I wasn't going to talk about, but maybe it's worth it. When you talk about the fact that the great apes are doing poorly, in fact, we are living, due to humans, in probably one of the greatest periods of extinction of life on the planet. More species are probably going extinct now at a faster rate other than perhaps when there were global catastrophes like a meteor hitting the Earth and killing the dinosaurs, perhaps, or something like that. But one of the things that may be worth stressing, especially when we talk about intelligent design, which we won't talk about much. But
I'm all for intelligent design. I'd like to see more intelligent
design.
Yeah,
I'd like to see exactly. Yeah. But in nature, one of the arguments that's worth pointing out when people argue that we're designed and the whole Earth was created so we would be here, and we'll get to that in a moment, is the fact to realize that probably 99.999% of all species that have ever existed are extinct.
Yeah.
Which doesn't suggest good design.
No. Well, nothing suggests design. Well, no, that's not quite true. I mean, superficially, things look designed until you look closely at them, and then you see all the bad design features, all the what an engineer would see as design faults. I mean, sort of really crazy things that any decent engineer would send back to the shop for doing. I mean, things like the recurrent laryngeal nerve that goes down into the chest and then back up again, rather than going by its most direct route to its end organ. The kind of thing. It's exactly what you'd expect if we're historical accidents, rather than if we're designed.
Now, the other argument that I often get when talking is first is the monkeys and people argument, and then the next one is if evolution really happened, why isn't it happening now? And so
it is. It's happening all the time, but once again, on a timescale that's mostly too slow for us to see. We are condemned to live only for a few decades, and that's too slow, too small a timescale to see evolution going on in the sort of interesting animals that we like to see. We can see it in bacteria, only too vividly, because of course that's why antibiotic resistance is such an immensely important medical problem. If doctors at the time of the invention of penicillin had their Darwinian wits about them, they would have been able to predict that resistance to antibiotics would have evolved very fast, which indeed it has. And by the way, I hope there are some doctors here, it's very, very important for doctors to understand Darwinism, and I recommend Nessie and Williams's book on Darwinian medicine. It's got the ridiculous title, Why We Get Sick. Why would any doctor buy a book called Why We Get Sick? But the real title of that book is The Science of Darwinian Medicine, and I wrote a blurb for it which said, buy 2 copies and give 1 to your doctor. So if there are any doctors here, please read that book. It's very important.
You know, it's interesting, because I don't know if you've had this happen, but I've had people write me saying, I'm a medical doctor, and I don't believe in evolution.
That's a disgrace.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to say that, because, especially in this country, one's private beliefs are supposed to be irrelevant. But I would walk out of a doctor's office and not consult him anymore if I heard that he said that, because what that doctor is saying is that he's a scientific ignoramus and a fool.
We'll get back to that.
And you don't want a doctor who's a fool.
Yeah, or if, as we'll talk about, or politicians, as we'll get to in a bit. But in fact, in that regard, it's interesting to me at the same time how people can hold beliefs which are incompatible with other beliefs they have. And in some sense, everyone is a scientist. They just don't realize they are. And yet, when it's a time of crisis, that's when it's the case. The example I give is when George Bush was president, he said intelligent design should be taught alongside evolution so kids will know what the debate's all about. And it wasn't a stupid statement a priori. It was ignorant, because it was just didn't realize there's no debate. There's no debate. And that's fine. I don't mean ignorant in a pejorative sense. I just mean it wasn't aware.
Ignorance is no crime.
Yeah.
You just don't want to consult a doctor who's ignorant.
But what amazed me is that, in the same administration, when the avian flu, of course, was going to be a problem and mutating to humans, President Bush said, we've got to find out how long it takes before the avian flu will mutate into humans. And what amazed me is that no one in his administration, not a single person, said, you know, it's been designed to kill us. Forget about it.
Yeah. Now, this kind of... It's a very good point. This kind of split brain business, which you've just been referring to, the most glaring example I know is actually more in your field than mine. I was told by the professor of astronomy at Oxford of a colleague of his who's an astronomer, an astrophysicist, who writes learned papers, mathematical papers, published in astronomical journals, mathematical papers, assuming that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. But he privately believes the universe is only 6,000 years old. And now, how can a man like that hold down a job in a university as an astrophysicist? And yet we are told, well, it's his private beliefs. You mustn't interfere with this man's private beliefs as long as he writes competent papers in astronomical journals. That's fine.
As long as he doesn't, well, I mean, the key thing is, does he teach his private beliefs?
Okay, let's hypothetically suppose that he teaches absolutely correctly that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. How could you want to take a class from a man who teaches one thing and believes something so many orders of magnitude different?
It demonstrates, you're right. I mean, from my point of view, it would be an interesting question from a university tenure point of view, because it demonstrates clearly intellectual deficiency. And in fact, a scholarly deficiency, because if you can't tell, there's an inconsistency. And in fact, it's not just him. And I have people, in fact, you may not be aware, but you can go on YouTube and see one of our state senators talk about the fact that when radioactive waste disposal, and she says you have to keep it for a long time because the Earth is 6,000 years old. And when people say that to me, I not only get offended, but I call them hypocrites, because in fact they are. If they drive a car, if they use a toaster, if they take drugs, if they do anything that is modern society, the chemistry, the biology, the physics that makes those things possible is completely inconsistent with the 6,000-year-old Earth. So you cannot believe that and use a car or get in an airplane without calling yourself a hypocrite. And in fact, this person clearly, in my mind, you're absolutely right, is not competent to teach in a university.
Yeah.
I'd have to say. We'll get to astronomy in a bit, but before we get to the, we've talked about the sort of obvious problems that people have with evolution and some of the misconceptions. But let's jump ahead and talk about some forefront science, so we can do that this evening. What do you think is the most exciting sort of set of developments that are taking place in evolutionary biology, or I mean, we heard some of them at the meeting that we had, that you and I were at, and I know what excited me the most, but I wanted to see
I mean, at that meeting which we had here, we were talking about the origin of life, and the questions like, how much of what we know about life on this planet had to be true because there's only one way for life to be, and how much of it just happens to be true, and therefore, by implication, if you discover life elsewhere in the universe, it'll be different. So, for example, I would put my shirt on saying that there has to be a genetics of some sort. I put my shirt on the genetics having to be extremely high fidelity, which DNA is. But I wouldn't put my shirt on it being DNA. It's got to be something that's just as good as DNA. I think I might put my shirt on protein being the actual executive part of the equation. And I think I would put my shirt on protein not being the genetic molecule itself. Protein is very ill-suited to being a coding molecule, to transmitting information. So the separation between a genetic molecule and an executive molecule is probably something that all life has to have. And probably it's got to be protein. I mean, protein has this remarkable property of coiling up into an exact three-dimensional shape determined by its one-dimensional sequence of building blocks, of amino acids. But still, these are questions which biologists need to talk about. Could you imagine an alternative biochemistry which is different from ours?
In fact, there was some at our meeting. People were trying to build genetic sequences with 6 sets of base pairs instead of 4.
That's right. I mean, you could certainly imagine a different kind of genetic code. And before the genetic code was established as a triplet code, no less than the great Francis Crick played around with alternative genetic codes. And indeed, he found one that looked much more intelligently designed than the one we actually have. But maybe it doesn't have to be a triplet code. Maybe you could have more than 4 bases, 4 letters of the alphabet. And these are all interesting questions which are at the moment unsolved.
One of the things that hit me, and I'll go out on a limb, although not that much of a limb perhaps, during our meeting, as you pointed out, biology comes from chemistry. And we were discussing processes that are getting closer and closer to the origin of life. We had a geologist here from ASU talking about some remarkable fact that in extreme environments, as could have existed in the early Earth, right now it takes energy to build up complex biomolecules. And so it seems, how could you imagine building up something like RNA or its precursor? But in fact, under extreme conditions, you can show the reactions go the other way, that in fact it's endothermically favorable for large molecules to be built up. But when I started to see what people who were trying to develop alternative sequences were doing, it seemed to me more and more, I would be very surprised personally if in fact life could be any different than it is. I mean, you can imagine differences, but as you point out, life is historical. It had to come from chemistry, and therefore it had to come from energetics and entropy, and it was driven in a certain direction. And at this meeting, as listening to the chemists, I began to think that maybe the possibilities are restricted, and in fact, the reason life has the form it has is that if you designed it, you could create anything. If you allow it to happen naturally by chemical processes, it will always be driven in the same direction. It will always be driven to the same 4 base pairs. And so it'd be interesting to me, but I'd bet that if we discover life elsewhere, it's going to have exactly the same properties.
Huh. I wouldn't bet on that. I would bet that it's going to have a genetics. The genetics will be digital. It won't. I don't know whether it has to be one-dimensional, like DNA and RNA are. I could imagine a 2-dimensional matrix as being a decodable information store. I don't think it could be 3-dimensional because you can't read out from a 3-dimensional object so easily.
Though we're doing that in physics, but yeah, eventually you could.
Eventually you could, maybe. I don't know whether it would be multicellular, and one of the remarkable things about life as we know it is that we are made of trillions of cells, and every one of them has a complete set of all the genes in it. That's not obvious to me that life's got to have that. When you get to larger properties like eyes and ears and wings and things, that would depend on the physical conditions.
Well, but it'll be interesting to see if we discover life elsewhere exactly that case. And I suspect, I would be surprised if we didn't find life elsewhere in the solar system, but the problem is it's probably our cousins, because we've learned
You think it's contaminated?
The planets have contaminated each other.
By meteorites, because we know that there have been meteorites from Mars landing here.
And we know that life can exist in extreme environments now, and certainly survive the 6-month trip. At least microbes could survive embedded in rock. So it would be the big surprise, as a friend of mine at Harvard who studies these things and is involved in Mars missions looking for life. The biggest surprise would not be to find life on Mars or extant life on Mars, but rather to find out that it wasn't our cousins. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in that regard.
Well, Paul Davies, of course, would like to find a completely alien form of life right here.
Because if we could find 2 geneses, then it would indicate that life is not so rare.
That would be just wonderful. It's sort of the principle of looking for your keys under the lamppost, because that's where the light is rather than...
Well, exactly. Now, but this leads to a question which may allow us to segue to another area, which is when we'll find out, I hope, whether life is unique, Einstein asked a question in the case of physics, which I suppose you could ask in the case of biology. He phrased it poorly because
Did God have a choice?
Yeah, he said, did God have a choice in the creation of the universe? And by that he didn't mean God. He meant, is there just one set of laws of physics, and if you twiddle one knob, will the whole thing fall apart? But I think it's an interesting question also in the case of biology, and we'll find out. Did God have a choice in the creation of life in that sense? Is there one?
We've talked about that, and you've come down heavily on one extreme, which is that there is no choice, and I came down on a slightly less extreme. But going to the physics question and the idea that the physical constants, whatever it is, half a dozen or so numbers, which physicists can't explain at the moment, but just simply accept as physical constants. If you twiddle those knobs, and you get would you get a different kind of universe? Would you get no universe at all? Is there only one way for a universe to be? I mean, what's your view?
Well, that is, in fact, I think the central question of physics. And sometimes the thing that drives me, and I suspect many of my colleagues who do particle physics or cosmology, the question is, I grew up, I became a scientist because I wanted to understand why the universe is the way it is, not why it should often be different. And therefore, the suspicion and the way science has worked for 400 years is that, since Newton at least, and Galileo probably before that, is that in fact, in order to understand what we see, there are unique sets of physical laws, and we would hope that we might ultimately understand the set of physical laws that explained everything, and that there would be a theory of everything. That was a hope, and it's still a hope in some sense. But in fact, it is looking more and more to many people, to many physicists, like that hope may be misplaced, that in fact the laws of physics may be an environmental accident, and physics would become, God forbid, an environmental science. Because and the reason is this one discovery, which is really the reason I wrote the new book in some sense, the most inexplicable discovery in the last century, the fact that empty space has energy. That if you take a region of space, get rid of all the particles and all the radiation, everything, that space weighs something. There's nothing there, but it has energy. And it's changed everything about the future of the universe and the present, and maybe we'll talk about it. But it is something that is so inexplicable that physicists have latched on a possible solution, which is very unpalatable to many of us, but may be true. Why does empty space have the energy it does? We don't have any idea. In fact, it flies in the face of all fundamental calculations we can perform. If we perform fundamental calculations, we predict a number that's 120 orders of magnitude wrong. It's the worst prediction in all of physics, so we never used to talk about it. But in fact, there may be another explanation, and that is if the energy of empty space were much bigger, see, if you put energy in empty space, it's gravitationally repulsive. It blows, it doesn't suck. Okay? And that means that it's causing the current expansion of the universe to speed up, which is unprecedented, was almost unbelievable. But that means, well, and we'll talk about what it means for the future, but if the energy were much greater, then the universe would have started speeding up much earlier. And in fact, it would have started speeding up before galaxies formed. And that gravitational repulsion would have caused matter to move apart before it could collapse into galaxies. And that means there'd be no galaxies. But if there are no galaxies, there'd be no stars. If there are no stars, there'd be no planets. If there are no planets, there'd be no astronomers. And so the universe is the way it is because astronomers are here to measure it, is the argument. And it sounds funny, but it's actually maybe true. It's something called the anthropic principle. But if it's true, it means this fundamental constant in nature is an accident. And there may be many universes in which that number is different. But in those universes, there aren't people around or beings around, perhaps, to ask the question. So it addresses one of the fundamental aspects of the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is, if there were nothing, we wouldn't be here to ask the question.
I've always been very attracted by the anthropic principle. I think it's elegant and neat. I know physicists hate it. But I think you probably, in order to make it explanatory, give it explanatory power, you do need to postulate lots of universes, don't you?
You need to postulate universes, but you need to postulate more than just that. First of all, the anthropic principle, one of the things, it's often been proposed in physics, always when there's something inexplicable. And historically, at least, throughout the last century, there have been a number of times in the evolution of stars it looked like the parameters of physics had to be fine-tuned so you could make carbon and get, beyond helium. And it looked like, that has to be fine-tuned, and maybe it's anthropic. Maybe it's just a number that, if it were any different, we wouldn't be here. But every time that's happened, we've actually come up with a fundamental theory that explained it. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen this time. But the anthropic principle, in order to be predictive, you have to assume many universes. But you have to assume that you know the probability distribution for the parameters. Otherwise, you can't predict the likelihood that we'll be here. And you have to know which parameters are fixed by fundamental laws and which ones can vary, and we don't know that. And the other thing that it really assumes, which is really not at all clear, and it comes back to biology, is that we are typical. Because if we're not typical, it could be, we don't know the varieties of life that can exist. And it could be if the laws of nature were very different. You wouldn't form stars. You wouldn't form planets. But we don't know that you wouldn't form life. So you have to assume for the anthropic principle to be operational that we are typical of life forms in the universe. And that is an incredible assumption that I think is not at this point warranted. So that's my big problem with the anthropic principle, is that we don't know in any sense that we're typical. And in fact, I've argued to some of my colleagues that if you use that typicality argument, we'd be having this discussion underwater. Because most of the Earth is covered in water. And if you ask where should life, intelligent life naturally arise, it should be in water. Because that's more probable. And so we're certainly not, at least the kind of life that can carry on this conversation doesn't exist in water. Whether there's intelligence in dolphins or others is something to be discovered. And so there are a lot of hidden assumptions, and the problem is it's hard to test them unless you have many different examples of life, or in some cases, unless you have many universes. And when it comes to cosmology, unlike potentially, well, with biology, we're suffering from the fact that we only know of life on Earth. And therefore, we make lots of speculations about the kind of life that might exist. In physics, in cosmology, we have a much bigger problem. We live in one universe. Well, most of us do. Again, except the Republican candidate. And that means we may forever have limits on our knowledge. And one of the things I try to talk about in my book, and one of the things that fascinates me, is we have made such progress that we may be pushing up against those limits right now. There may be fundamental scientific questions that we want to know the answer to that we never can get an empirical answer to because we're stuck either living 13.7 billion years after the Big Bang, and maybe if we'd lived earlier or later, we would have access to information we don't have, because we could talk about the fact that in the future there'll be much less information, or the fact that we just live in one universe and we can't access the locus of all possible universes. And
one of the things that fascinated me about your book is this idea that we live, as you put it, in a very propitious time. Because if we lived, I don't know, a trillion years later, the universe would have deleted all traces of its origins, of its progenitors that we can detect, because we happen to be living at this time when light can still reach us from other galaxies. Whereas if we lived in a trillion years' time, the galaxies would have receded beyond the horizon where we could detect them. And we would have absolutely no evidence of any kind that there was more than one galaxy, for example.
In fact, I find it very poetic. In fact, what you'd find in a trillion years in the future is that we'd go back to the picture we had merely 100 years ago. And that's one of the other reasons to write a book like this at this time, is that it is amazing. We're like the early map makers. It is amazing in a single human lifetime how much things have changed. It's hard to appreciate it. 85 years ago, 85 years ago, a single human lifetime easily, we knew of one galaxy in the universe. That was it. The conventional scientific wisdom was that our Milky Way was the entire universe. We now know there are 400 billion galaxies in the observable universe. 85 years ago, the universe was static and eternal as far as scientists were concerned. So their picture of the universe was that we lived in a single galaxy surrounded by an eternity of empty space, that had always been that way and always would be that way. And everything changed. Of course, we discovered the universe had a beginning, which had profound significance for science and for theology, as we may talk about. And if you go in the far future, what is kind of remarkable to me is that beings who live on what will be the Milky Way galaxy, because we're going to collide with our neighbors and we'll form some big, not a nice spiral galaxy, but probably something called an elliptical galaxy. But there'll be stars around in 2 trillion years, stars like our sun, that therefore have solar power, and there'll be organic molecules, and there'll be planets around them, and therefore you could imagine life forming around those stars. But astronomers who will discover the laws of physics, they'll discover general relativity, they'll discover electromagnetism, they'll discover quantum mechanics, and they'll do the best experiments they can do. They'll build telescopes, and they'll come up with a picture which is completely wrong. They'll come up with a picture which is identical to the picture we had.
Just one galaxy, and that's it.
Yeah. So we are lucky, and in fact, I like to say we live at we're fortunate to live at a very special time. the only time when we can know we're living in a very special time. And but by that I mean I'm facetious, because we have this picture which is weird, but it may not be complete. It could be that those beings living 100 billion or trillion years from now will have access to observational information of some sort that we don't have today.
We don't know about. Yeah.
And so we should have some kind of cosmic humility, which is very difficult for cosmologists.
Let me come on to the. I want to ask you about the very title of your book and the idea of something from nothing. You are telling us that matter arose spontaneously out of nothing, which I find an immensely exciting idea, but many people will find it mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling and offensive. I think maybe not as offensive.
To hell with offensive, but
no,
mind-boggling.
No. Well, you're not offended, but I checked my email. It amazes me because the purpose of the book, to some extent, is to say something remarkable. And you were kind enough afterward to point out the analogy to Darwin, and I was pretentious to make it, perhaps. But the physicist Steven Weinberg said, science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. Because until you have science, everything's a miracle. And what Darwin showed, as you said at the beginning of our discussion, is this miracle is actually plausible from basic principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. That you can produce us without a creator, without an intelligence. And what we've learned is remarkably this question, which is, in the sense of cosmology, in my mind, the last bastion of those people who feel there must be a creator, is the fact that it is plausible, based on everything we now know, that a universe could come from nothing. Now, that doesn't mean it did come from nothing any more than Darwin's argument implied that life absolutely originated by chemistry. We don't know that yet. Similarly, we can't prove that the universe arose from nothing, but the discoveries in physics and cosmology have led us to realize that it's increasingly plausible, and I find that remarkable and worth celebrating. And one of the examples of that, and there's a number, but maybe some of them are too much for us to talk about tonight, is this remarkable fact that nothing is unstable, that empty space is unstable. The laws of quantum mechanics, combined with gravity, will tell you that if you have empty space there, and you wait long enough, particles will be created. And if you wait long enough, empty space will always produce a universe full of matter. And it's not a scam. There's no violation of energy conservation. It's from the fact that gravity can have negative energy as well as positive energy. And so nothing is unstable. And in fact, that's the first answer to why there's something rather than nothing, is that nothing's unstable. The big surprise would be if there was nothing. Not that there's something. Now, the problem, of course, of saying that is people say, that's not nothing. That's not, and and it's an interesting problem, because when I've discussed this with theologians and philosophers, some of them, and you ask, what's nothing? And my argument is that these are scientific questions, not philosophical or theological ones. And I think the nothing that Aristotle would have had, or St. Thomas Aquinas, or any of the people who first asked why is there something rather than nothing, that nothing would have been an eternal empty void, namely empty space. But once I argue that empty space can create something, then immediately I'm told that's not nothing.
Yeah.
And then I show that space itself can be created from nothing, and then I'm told that's not nothing. And then I say, well, because there are still laws of physics. And then I argue that, in fact, the laws of physics, for the reasons we've discussed, the anthropic principle, there may be many universes, and it's quite likely that even the laws of physics themselves arose by accident when the universe was created. So even the laws aren't there. And I'm told that's not nothing. And the definition of theologians, I think, for nothing is that from which only God can create something. And I find that as sort of content-free, although I guess I think I say in the book that maybe I'm not fit to talk about nothing because theologians and philosophers are experts in nothing. But anyway,
I've been accustomed to the idea that pushing back from biology into physics, you get back to a zone where we don't understand, and you get back to a zone where there's not nothing but sort of a primeval simplicity. What I learned from your book, which I find stunningly exciting is that it is literally nothing. I mean, that's what really, and as you say, even the laws of physics
and space,
you can explain.
Space, you can create a universe where there's no space before.
Yeah. So I do find that it's sort of mind-numbing in a way, because it's pushing the Darwinian dream to an extreme, which biologists couldn't have dreamed of.
I think in a sense it is, and it's fascinating to me that we're beginning to get there, and I think that's worth sharing. We don't have the conclusions, and we don't have a dogmatic conclusion, and we'll get back to the fact that it amazes me, and I think you find the same thing, because I know what I've read about you, by people who disagree with you, is if you say this is possible, then you're suddenly told that you're shrill and dogmatic. But we'll get there. But before we do, I mean, one of the things that we just talked about is how amazing the universe really is. And I want to turn back to you. We talked about my book, but you just wrote a book called The Magic of Reality, which is ostensibly supposed to be for children. I wanted, if you could talk about why you wrote it and why you think it's important.
Well, any scientific book that's important is worth writing for children, because they're the future, and as is often said, the sort of natural born scientists in any case. So I'd always wanted to write a children's book, but actually I like to think that it's readable, it's understandable by adults as well.
In fact, I would argue, yeah, I often say if the children understand, there's a possibility the adults don't understand it. But in fact, I wrote a blurb for the back of the book, and I really think actually, while it is in principle called a children's book, it actually addresses the very questions that not just children but adults ask. The kind, maybe you can indicate a few of the questions.
I haven't attempted to answer these very profound questions we've been talking about, which belong in the field of modern physics, 20th century, 21st century physics. I haven't tackled that at all. The physics that's in The Magic of Reality it's 19th century physics.
But most people don't know 19th century
that's
physics.
Right.
I think it's I mean, I don't want to do a disservice to people, because you can get along in life apparently without knowing it. But to be able to deal with those basic concepts without being patronizing, and I think the book isn't patronizing, I think it makes it accessible and of interest to adults too.
I mean, it's questions like why do we have winter and summer? Why do we have night and day? I mean, even easy questions like why do we have winter and summer? It's amazing how many people think the reason we have winter is that's when the Earth is furthest away from the sun.
I was going to ask the question here.
Are you okay?
No, it's all right. We've already given it up. But
okay.
But
I mean, I haven't. It's just if there are any Australians present, they would.
They would know the difference.
Yeah.
In fact, studies have been shown if you ask that question, the majority of people will say, in summer the Earth is closer to the sun than in winter.
Well, as an Australian would say, Northern Hemisphere chauvinism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the tilt of the Earth, and it's described there. But when you were writing with kids in mind, did it change the way you wrote compared to when you were writing?
I think just a bit of restriction of vocabulary. I like to when writing for adults, use the full vocabulary at my disposal, and I think it's fun to we have a beautiful instrument in the English language, and I think we should use it to the full. But when writing for children, I would tend to avoid using words that too many words that need to be looked up in the dictionary. I mean, there's no harm in looking words up in a dictionary, and we should all do it from time to time, but you don't want to look up too many. So that's really the only restriction.
That was the only restriction. Otherwise,
so.
You
Yes.
didn't find your writing style had to change at all.
Don't think so. No, no.
Yeah, I didn't notice it when I read the book, and I was wondering if there was any conscious thought in your mind. Now, this allows us to segue to something which we would be remiss if we did not discuss, which is religion, and science and religion in some sense. I would suggest that one of the reasons that it's really important to teach kids about science is that they're often that they're brainwashed from a young age with other ideas. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Maybe the fact that...
Yes, I mean, I think that is absolutely true. And when we talked about this astronomer who thinks the world is 6,000 years old, and one knows of many other people who think that, I mean, that is so ludicrous. That's got to be due to childhood indoctrination. There's no other, I think, reasonable explanation. And I think it is a tragic abuse of childhood. I won't say abuse of children because that has other connotations, but abuse of childhood to fill a child's mind,
but I won't use it. Okay.
to fill a child's mind with what are now known to be falsehoods, just because they have some kind of historic origin.
Before we get to that, I want to touch on whether science is incompatible with religion in your view, and why. And I'll talk about my opinion in that regard too. But one of the things that you've set out, well, we both enjoy teaching science, and we want to, and one of my goals and your goals is to help people understand science. But I think it's fair to say that one of your purposes in doing that is to destroy religion, is it not?
Well, I love truth. I love scientific truth. And in my own field of biology, ever since Darwin, we've got a very, very long way towards understanding it. And I'm now learning that in your field, we're coming stunningly close to understanding everything. And that is such a beautiful idea, such a wonderful, exciting, exhilarating idea, that it is, I would go as far as to say, an obscenity to fill a child's mind with a parochial, small-minded, petty, medieval alternative, which has nothing going for it whatever.
It sounds like we're preaching to the converted, but I bet in the question period we'll find we're not.
What was that quote from Stephen Weinberg that you just...
Science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God, it just makes it possible to not believe.
Yeah, I think that's too weak. In the following sense, that it doesn't just make God redundant, it doesn't just give God nothing to do, which it certainly does. I mean, biology, ever since Darwin, has left God nothing to do. And it now sounds as though physics is doing the same thing. But a God who has nothing to do is still a complex, improbable entity of exactly the kind that we spent our lives explaining. So the whole Darwinian enterprise and the whole enterprise that you're engaged in physics is to explain how we can get to things like gods and explain them. And so if you suddenly then import a god at the beginning of the universe, that's a betrayal of the entire scientific enterprise. It's not just that God's not necessary. God's an excrescence, a carbuncle on the face of science.
Well, okay. In fact, I agree with it. Actually, we were talking earlier. I think it's even stronger than that, in some sense. God is not, in order for God to do everything God has purported to do, God has to be much more complex than we are. In fact, you're imagining a being of incredible complexity, in fact, in religion, unfathomable complexity, and you're just positing it by fiat. But you're saying that the complexity of the regular complexity that you or I can't be made by natural processes, and you're postulating that the pre-existence of something that's far more complex than we are.
Precisely. I mean, that's exactly right. And not only does God have to be a master physicist and so on, he's got to be in telepathic communication with everybody praying to him. He's got to know all our sins. He's got to forgive us if he feels like it. He's got to cure people of cancer if he's asked to. I mean, all those sorts of things which are simply adding to the problem. So I think the Weinberg quote that you gave is just too weak. I think we can say positively.
Well, I think at the same time, and I think one has to be careful. But even here, and I should say that our views have come together a lot more. If you listened to us 5 years ago, we were more divergent, I think. And I like to think I've convinced you, but no. But that it's worked both ways. I can definitely attest. But one can say, I think it's important to say that we cannot, and I try and say in the book, that I can't prove that there's no intelligence governing the universe at some vague level, in a deistic level, or even a theistic level, where you say, well, maybe there is some intelligence that caused it all to happen. I can't prove that. What I can say is there's absolutely no evidence of that. That I can say as a scientist, but I can't really say that I can prove, therefore, by lack of evidence, you can't prove it in the negative. But nevertheless, that's not the same as saying, people say, well, therefore, God can't disprove the existence of God. But that kind of God has nothing to do with the God of Judaism or Christianity or Islam. It's a personal God, has nothing to do with that. It's a giant leap of illogic to go from that kind of God to a God that cares about us. And so I'm always amazed that people, even in the case of cosmology, saying, well, there's room for God at the beginning of the universe, somehow say that that must mean that Jesus Christ
died for our sins. I mean,
yeah,
right.
There's no logical connection between those two. And
no, but I mean, I've been caught out with this before. I've said something similar to what you've said, and I've said, well, of course, maybe there could be a deistic God, but that's very, very different from the God of the Christians or the Jews. And I've been pounced on later. Dawkins believes in a deistic God. And that's really happened to me. And so I want to reiterate what I said about the Weinberg quote. Not only you cannot, of course, disprove a deistic God any more than you can disprove leprechauns and hobgoblins and things. But you can say something much stronger than that, which is that even a deistic God would still have to be exactly the kind of thing that we spent our lives explaining and have gone a long way towards succeeding. Intelligence, whether it's godlike or anything else, intelligence comes late in the universe. Intelligence comes at the end of a long process of evolution.
The end, unless we're the end.
No, I didn't mean the end. Intelligence comes after a long period of development, of evolution, starting from literally nothing, as we've now learned, and then chemistry takes over, biology takes over, and so there may be in the universe godlike beings. There probably are life forms which are so much more advanced than us that if we were to meet them, we would fall to our knees and worship them. But they would still be the product of a process, explicable process of evolutionary development. They would not be gods in the sense of having created the laws of physics or created the universe or created life or something of that sort.
Okay, and I think, that's true, and there's another stronger thing I think one could say. When people ask me if I'm an atheist, as a scientist, you're not certain of anything. There are things that are probable and things that are improbable. And what you can do is you can say, I can say, looking at the universe, that I can't say that there's no God, but I can say the universe looks just like a universe that would be created without one. And moreover, that just like I can't say, using Bertrand Russell's famous analogy of a China teapot, I can't prove that there's no teapot orbiting Jupiter. But what I can say is extremely improbable. And so what I can say about the universe is that I can't say that there isn't a God, but I can say that everything we know makes it, for me, as a scientist, extremely improbable. And so that doesn't, you may say that doesn't make me an atheist, but in fact, I would argue that I'm not. Our dear friend, our late friend, Christopher Hitchens, who was a friend of both of ours and a wonderful man, I would call myself what he said. I'm an anti-theist. Namely, I can't prove that there's no God. I just wouldn't want to live in a universe with one. And so that's my. And I'm upfront about that bias. No, I wouldn't want to live with Saddam Hussein in the sky.
That's right. I mean, Christopher Hitchens' reason for that was a sort of political one, that living in a universe with a God would be like living with a divine Kim Il-sung. I mean,
exactly. It doesn't put you in jail for a year, but for eternity. For doing the silliest thing.
So his was a moral reason, which I respect. But mine would be a scientific reason. I wouldn't wish to. I mean, if there were a God which undermined the whole scientific enterprise, then science would be pointless. There would be no point doing science if there's a sort of magician deciding what's going to happen and changing the laws of physics at will or inventing them in the first place. So that's a different reason for not wanting to live in a universe. And I'm glad to say there is no evidence.
Okay, I want to get near the end here because we started late, and then we're going to go for about 4 or 5 more minutes, and then we're going to take a break for 20. But I don't think we've offended enough people. So let's go a little further, because I know we've had this discussion. And let's talk about religion and politics. Because in this... Because you said something to me which I think is going to shock a lot of people here, and I think it's worth discussing. We both agreed that the astronomer shouldn't be teaching astronomy when they have personal beliefs which are idiotic. And the doctor shouldn't be a doctor when they have personal beliefs that are idiotic. Now, I've known, basically, you have argued to me, and I think we should have that discussion, about whether that applies to politicians and particularly some of the politicians that are running for president now.
Well, I find myself in a difficult position because I'm kind of aware in America, and I'm not American as you can tell, that that the separation of church and state is deeply ingrained in the American politic, and rightly so. And John Kennedy, when challenged on his Catholicism, rightly said this is a separate matter, and as long as I don't bring my Catholicism into policy, you've nothing to complain about. And this is very, very, very laudable. But going back to the doctor, the hypothetical doctor and the astronomer, if you knew that one of the candidates that you're contemplating voting for believed that in the 19th century a man called Joseph Smith dug up some golden tablets which he translated and then conveniently lost, and translated, moreover, although a 19th century man translated them into 17th century English, and lots and lots of other...
And more importantly, unlike some of the... I mean, we also agree that the biblical stories are equally ridiculous, but the difference is we don't know they were written by known con men, but in fact he was a known felon.
Yes, that is true. And so if the person you're contemplating voting for believes all that, believes that the Garden of Eden was in Missouri, believes that Native Americans are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, believes that Jesus visited North America. I mean, these beliefs are barking mad. They contradict everything that's known historically, archaeologically. They contradict science. They contradict history. Now, is it a fair defense for such a candidate to say, oh, well, don't worry, I won't let my beliefs interfere with my policies? Well, maybe he won't, but do you want to vote for somebody who's capable of holding in his head such unrealistic nonsense? I mean, do you want a president who believes palpably foolish things, even if he promises that he won't actually let them... it's just back to the problem of the doctor and the astronomer again.
So, in case we're not being clear enough, is religion fair game when journalists question the president?
That's the point. My view, and it's not a popular view in America, my view is that a candidate's religious beliefs are fair game for journalists to ask questions and for debaters. When candidates are having a debate, it seems to me absolutely reasonable to say to a candidate, do you believe so-and-so? I mean, I would be prepared to say to a Catholic such as John Kennedy, do you actually believe that the bread actually turns into the body of Christ?
Yeah, no, in fact, I was on a stage once with several members of the Vatican, and I asked if they believed in the virgin birth, and I couldn't get an answer from them, which amazed me. I mean, because in fact, I think we both agree that most people what people want to do is they want to believe, to take a line from the X-Files, they want to believe in believing. And so most people who of faith, I think, in our society, naturally pick and choose from the doctrine those things they find absolutely ridiculous and throw out.
Yeah.
And the question is, and the Pope would say that's not palatable, and I would tend to agree with the Pope. I think if you can't believe some of the stuff and you need to throw it out, just forget the whole thing.
Yeah. That would be my view, and I suspect that there are 535 members of the U.S. Congress, and one has said that he doesn't believe in a supreme being. That's statistically not possible. I mean, a fair number of those members of Congress presumably have had some sort of education.
I mean, it's not obvious.
Not all, but a good number. I mean, there have got to be a very substantial number of atheistic members of the United States Congress. Probably more than a couple of hundred would be my guess. And yet they cannot admit it. So in order to get elected, you have got to lie about your beliefs.
And I think that's right, and I think it's good to call them on it. In one sense, I disagree with you slightly, maybe because I spent a lot more time in this country. And I would say, another friend of mine, Noam Chomsky, who I asked about this, said, I don't care what people believe, it's what they do that's important. And to some extent I agree, but my point is, if people don't hold the religion on their sleeve, so it's obviously not relevant, like Lincoln, say, that it's not relevant to them, then it's not relevant, then it's not in the public domain, and journalists needn't ask questions about it. But if they do hold the religion on their sleeve, then it becomes in the public domain, and it becomes appropriate for journalists to bring it up. So because then it's an action. They're saying, elect me because I'm a person of faith, not because I believe that we need to improve the economy or this or that. So that becomes their action in the process of an election, and then it becomes a legitimate target, in my opinion, for journalists, and they shouldn't show a mercy.
No, I mean, I think that's almost obvious, but I'm really coming back to the nub of the question, which is that even if they don't take any action based upon it, I mean, would you, going back to the doctor, an extreme example which I actually published on a blog somewhere, was a hypothetical doctor who doesn't believe in the sex theory of reproduction, believes in the stork theory of reproduction. I thought I was pushing to the limit. I assumed that everybody would agree with me, at least here, that you would not wish to consult such a doctor. Not a bit of it. I was kicked around the room on this American blog. The doctor's private beliefs are his private beliefs. They're no business of yours. So long as he can take your appendix out, whatever he has to do, then it doesn't matter that he doesn't believe in sex. He believes in the stork theory. That's where we're disagreeing, because...
Well, I guess but the stork theory is relevant to his career as a doctor.
Well, make him an eye doctor then.
No, but I'd have to say, for a politician, if I think there are rights to privacy. I think if someone believes that it's okay for them to have sex with animals, I shouldn't ask that question as long as they don't make it a campaign platform. And so I happen to think that there is some right to privacy in the sense that if you don't wear it on your sleeve, and these candidates do wear it on the sleeve, including, by the way, Obama, who was just talking about poverty because of Jesus the other day. And I think once you bring that up, then it becomes fair game. Now, let's end with, because you pointed out that there's one member of Congress, and I didn't know there were that many, who argues that he doesn't believe in a supreme being. I just wrote an article of a study that's been done by a group of psychologists in Canada and the United States. It's just been published. That asks what groups people distrust. And it turns out the group that is distrusted the most are atheists. Well, they're not quite the most. They're on par with rapists. And I wonder if you could comment.
Well, that seems to me to be an adequate explanation for why so many members of the United States Congress are obviously lying about their private beliefs. I mean, if you're on a par with rapists, then
it doesn't seem to stop
so,
Congress people. But anyway,
I suspect that we've already had in this country quite a number of atheist presidents. I suspect.
Thomas Jefferson probably was in a way.
Yes. Well, in the 18th century, that was before Darwin. It was a little bit harder.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Kennedy was an atheist. It wouldn't surprise me if Clinton was an atheist. It wouldn't surprise me if Obama's an atheist. But you cannot admit it, or you simply don't get elected. I would like to start a campaign for what are they called, lame duck presidents and senators and people to say, okay, I'm not standing for election anymore. I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist all along.
Well, that probably is a good place to get close to stopping, because I will say that one of the things that impacted upon me the most in our discussions and listening to you is the notion that we need to consciousness raise. So at least the question, just questioning the existence of a deity, doesn't become akin in our society to being evil, to being someone you don't trust. That just questioning, which is really at the basis of science, which is at the basis of progress, should be something we revere rather than revile. And so I applaud the efforts that you have made to raise people's consciousness, including my own. And I'll give the final example. One that I think I heard on this stage the first time you might have talked here was a wonderful example that is worth repeating, which is a picture at Christmas time of three children and three little kids. And one of them, and it says, and they're all playing together in this play, and one it says,
well, they're the three wise men in the Passion in the nativity play.
And it says this one's a Muslim child, and this one's a Christian child, and I don't know if one's a Jewish child. And then you pointed out, how dare we say a Muslim child? Why not say a
4 years old?
Or a libertarian child, or a neoconservative child,
a postmodernist child.
So I think we need to, and one of the ways to do that, I think, is have frank discussions about issues that we're often afraid to discuss in public, and I'm happy that we were able to do it here. So thank you very much. We'll go for a ride. Richard, come on back out for applause. Richard, come on back out.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Ron Woodworth. I finished my graduate studies here at Arizona State University and did my doctorate in religious studies at Trinity Seminary. So I really enjoy the opportunity to come in and hearing you, Dr. Dockins. I've studied a lot, and Lawrence, this is my first time I've heard you, but thank you for your sharing as well. My main argument or critique.
You have a question?
Yes, this is it, and it's based upon my main critique.
Okay.
My main critique is, I don't think that it's necessary to join together a scientific inquiry, regardless of how speculative or dramatic it may be, with an atheistic proposition. I'm not a scientist. I know several scientists. I've interviewed them from here and elsewhere, as you have. And here's my observation. As long as scientific inquiry is possible, which would be as long as matter exists, there can never be ultimate proof of God's non-existence. And I think, Dr. Lawrence, you were making that observation a little bit more, but I just want to end with this little statement, and this is Hebrews 11:2. Believe it or not.
Well, okay. I think you made your point. I think you made your point. I'll respond to this one. Does that sound good? Or you could take a crack at it too. Okay. But let me just point out, I agree, as I said before, that personally, that obviously we can't, there are limits to our knowledge. And by knowledge, I mean empirical knowledge, because for me that's the only kind of knowledge. But there's a famous biologist whose name I can't remember, and you might remember, who said, when I go into the laboratory, I behave as if I'm an atheist. I don't think there's someone twiddling the dials or determining the results of my experiment other so all my physical effects come from physical causes. And so, actually, the key thing about science and God is that God is irrelevant to science. I think that's what another thing that Steve Weinberg said is that,
well, maybe to you, but not to every scientist.
The good thing is I'm up here, so I get to talk.
Okay.
Sorry. What Weinberg said, which I think is really important, is that my mind just went because you brought it up and I had to be rude to you.
Thank you.
That we can forget it. I can't.
Well,
remember.
I mean,
you can go. I'll come in a second.
The fact is, we discussed exactly this question. There's nothing more to be said. I mean, we both said what we had to say at some length during our discussion.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, probably. Okay. I'll remember what I was going to say, and I'll come back and answer someone's question with the answer to that one, probably. But yes, okay.
Hi. I teach public school, 8th grade, and my question is, why does the educated in this country tend to go towards universities? And then we have this sort of glut of people who are doing something great, like, physics or biology, and not so many people who can get the good word out there and have people know about science. So what can we do to address that problem?
Well, which problem?
All of them.
I mean, there are a lot of. There are one way we can address problems, and I think we're both interested in this. And I will say the Origins Project is particularly interested in this. Is part of the problem of science education is the fact that the people who are teaching science aren't comfortable with science. That in this country, over 80% of middle school science teachers don't have science backgrounds, and that means that they're uncomfortable. I've seen it happen when my own daughter was in school, that her teacher was uncomfortable talking about basic properties of nature, and that lack of comfort goes across to the students. So we have to do a better job training teachers and also encouraging people who have science backgrounds to go into teaching. And that may mean, in my opinion, doing some things that are not particularly popular, like maybe paying science teachers more.
And paying them more and respecting them. Teacher is a very honourable profession, and so qualified scientists who've done a university degree, done a PhD in science, should consider teaching as one of the best things they could possibly do with their science degree.
Absolutely. And we will, as long as we're here, we're going to do what we can to. And there's a big program here at ASU to put an advertisement to try and in fact improve the teaching of training of science teachers and to encourage kids to go into science teaching. And it's of vital importance. I do remember what I was going to say, but I'll repeat it later.
When you were talking about the possibility of life that is not on this planet, life, what do you think about the possibilities of life that is either not carbon-based or not in sacks of water? That is at a chemical level very, very different from terrestrial life.
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
What she's saying, what about the possibility of life that basically is not chemistry?
Or not necessarily not chemical, but not sharing any elements of biochemistry with the life we're familiar with, either not based in carbon or not floating around in water?
I mean, I'm fascinated by the possibility, and we were discussing this, the possibility that a form of life might exist which is entirely different. And whenever I meet chemists, I try to persuade them to speculate about possible alternative biochemistries. I mean, could you even imagine a non-carbon-based life form, for example? And you think about what's special about carbon, its capacity to form long chains, loops. I think there's one other element that has that. Silicon has that property. Could you imagine a silicon-based life? Well, I certainly can imagine a silicon-based life, but that would be via the medium of our carbon-based life. And I could imagine some distant future in which a hole like this might be full of silicon life forms who look back and speculate about some far distant dawn age in the distant past when there was some sort of squishy carbon-based life form which gave rise to us, and the problem of the origin of life might be solved when they realized that life hadn't always been silicon-based.
It's true. In fact, that may be the next phase of evolution. Certainly, I've said it, and I believe it, that machine-based intelligence will not only happen, but once it does, it will easily be able to outbeat biology, and biology will have to accommodate it if it wants to survive in one way or another. But let me also say that it's an example of what I think you can imagine lots of possibilities, but I think Richard put it when he talked about finding the lost keys under the lamppost. There are lots of possibilities, but since we don't know if any life can exist out there, the simplest thing is we know certain kinds of life do exist. We're an example. And so we search for that elsewhere. But there are people, and Paul Davies, one of my colleagues here, is actually trying to think of ways to look for example, could there be other life forms on Earth that we would have missed because all of our assays would be for carbon-based life? And it's hard to think of possibilities, but people are at least thinking about them. It's a long shot. It's a lot easier to look for what you know exists than what might. But it's certainly, if the key point is if we don't find life of the type we know, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And another example, Chris McKay, who is also affiliated with us and was on a stage with you and I recently, an astrobiologist, has pointed out the number of the early experiments performed on the first mission to Mars to look for life, in fact, we now understand could have killed a variety of kinds of life before it did. And so the new experiments are being redefined. So the lack of evidence for life on Mars that was found in those first missions could simply be that they didn't understand life well enough and they actually killed the life they were looking for.
Yes, you mentioned the fact that you might be preaching to the choir or the converted in your discussion earlier regarding several of the ideas. Do you find often that you are preaching to the choir or the converted, or do you think this setting is appropriate for disseminating these ideas further down into society, or are we just stagnating with them being discussed among the intelligentsia, or is there a more appropriate way? Is there a more appropriate way to disseminate this information further?
Well, first I'll say I know very few places. I'm always proud that we can get 3,000 people from Phoenix to come to these things. So, but I will say it requires going to lots of different places, and I think and it requires people. We have a bigger soapbox than some, but a lot of people say, "What can I do?" And I think each one of us who's interested in science education and reason has a forum. You go into your kids' schools or into your churches or wherever and talk about what's sensible. And we all have to be evangelists for science because God knows, forgive the expression, there are lots of people every day arguing against science around the country, and it requires the work of everyone, not just us.
I do think that scientists have a responsibility which not all of them bother with to talk widely and to stand up and be counted on some of these controversial issues. And so when people say that Lawrence and I and some of our colleagues are strident and shrill, it's because many of our colleagues just get on with their work and don't bother to stand up and say what they think. And I would appeal to scientists to, well, I'd almost say join us on the barricades, because we're feeling lonely.
And let me add to that. It is terrifying to I mean, this is a friendly audience, it seems, but to go into an environment that if you're an academic in particular, you're used to audiences that are quite sympathetic, and it is very difficult to go the first time you do it to an audience that might not be. But in fact, I think it's, well, give you an example. I was on Fox News a few years ago, and well, news is, I don't like to use that word when I would Fox, but I was on Hannity and Combs, okay, and I was debating at that time with the heads of the Southern Baptist Coalition, and I felt couldn't get a word in edgewise. Clearly, I got yelled down, but I did make a single statement, which was said without interruption, happily, and it was that you don't have to be an atheist to accept evolution. And I got more mail from people who accused me, in fact, of being humble, which was the first time I'd gotten that. But people who have been told every week in church and everywhere else that science is akin to atheism. And I think the point we've made is that atheism is that God is irrelevant to science. Evolution happened regardless of what you believe. So I think that single statement, even though I felt intellectually raped after that program, was worth going on the program and saying, because I think that's the kind of thing we need to counter, those lies about science.
I quite like to just sort of disagree with Lawrence for the first time this evening. I quite like the idea that people are being taught in their churches that evolution is incompatible with God, because we absolutely can demonstrate that evolution is a fact.
Good point. Good point. I'll take that one. That's good. Yes.
Personally, I just want to say that if as many people watch the Super Bowl watch this, we'd have a better society. So.
And if they paid as much for our commercials, then it'd be a much better.
You're right. You're absolutely right. My name is Ben Fama Jr. I'm a student documentary filmmaker. I'm making a film called A Virus Called Fear. And briefly, I was wondering if you can give me an input on how we went from having rational fear to like not get eaten by tigers and bears, and how we came to irrational fears like politics and religion.
Did you hear that?
I didn't hear. The problem is the loudspeakers are facing the audience.
Should I speak a little bit louder? Can you hear me?
No, not louder, slower.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm from Las Vegas. Everything's really fast.
There's an echo here, that's all.
I was wondering if briefly you can talk about fear and how it was a biological safety net for us to not get eaten by tigers, and how you feel that it evolved to irrational fears like politics and religion.
Okay, that's a very interesting thought. Certainly, fear would be a very valuable biological mechanism, because our ancestors would have lived perilous lives. They'd have been frightened of predators, lions, saber-tooths, no, probably not saber-tooths, and leopards. They would have had disease would have swooped without warning, without explanation, so they would naturally have tried to think of ways to avoid these terrible dangers. In the case of disease, which before modern science was completely unpredictable, unknowable, one would naturally fall into superstitious habits. I scratched my left ear, and something terrible happened. So maybe I should make sure I don't scratch my left ear again. These are superstitious responses, and when you're living in a world of ignorance, then if you're governed by fear, you could very well make up superstitions. Pigeons do it in Skinner boxes. Skinner himself did a very interesting experiment in which he put pigeons in a Skinner box is a cage in which if the pigeon does something like peck a key, it gets a reward, and pigeons readily learn to do that. Skinner put his pigeons in Skinner boxes where absolutely nothing that the pigeon did had any effect whatever, but nevertheless, at random, rewards were delivered. Okay? Which is sort of like our ancestors' world. And then, if he came back after a few hours and saw half a dozen pigeons under this regime, one pigeon would be preening under its left wing, another would be turning round in circles, another would be scratching the ground, another would be wiping its head on the ground, and another would be facing into the bottom left-hand corner. Each pigeon had superstitiously done something, accidentally been rewarded because that's when the mechanism produced the food, and carried on doing it. And so each pigeon became a kind of maniac for doing a particular ritual, which is exactly like one tribe sacrifices a goat in order to make the rains come. Another tribe gets down on its knees and faces Mecca and prays 5 times a day, whatever it is. Each tribe develops its own superstition in order to get rewarded, and of course in order to avoid being punished, in order to avoid the fearful consequences of random events which they had no control over. Nowadays, increasingly, we understand where danger comes from, we know where disease comes from, we don't know exactly, but approximately. We know how to control our world to an increasing extent, so we can afford to throw away those superstitions. Unfortunately, enormous numbers of us, the great majority of people on this planet, have failed to wean themselves off these primitive superstitions.
Let me just add one thing, because this was a difference. Well, I'm happy to applaud that, in fact. But because this is, I remember from an earlier discussion, we disagreed a little bit about this, but because Richard lives in Oxford, and I have to remind him that people are irrational as well as rational, that I think irrationality is a central part of being human. We need it. Each of us, every day, has to believe 10 impossible things before breakfast. To get up, you have to believe you love your wife, or you like your job, or whatever it is, and it's, and you're lying to yourself half the time, but we need it to get through life, and I think it's just, I do think there is probably an evolutionary basis of that at some level. To face with a universe that doesn't care about your existence, you often have to invent realities just to motivate yourself to go on living.
Robert Trivers, the distinguished evolutionary biologist, has just produced a book on self-deception and the evolutionary benefits of self-deception. I can't remember the title because it's one of those many books where the title is different in Britain and America, which is a scandal, by the way. That should never be allowed. I have actually, on occasion, bought the same book twice. And even worse than that, you know how Amazon puts up, if you like this book, you'll probably like this one.
But Richard,
yeah.
if you're an author, that's a very good thing.
Well, okay, that's a good thing. Anyway, Robert Trivers wrote this book on self-deception, where he makes the point that actually it is an evolutionary advantage to be optimistic and to believe that you're more intelligent than you really are, better looking than you really are, etc.
Yeah.
So there is real merit in what you've said.
Let's move on. I guess it's this side, right?
Okay. I mean, this is a follow-up to the earlier point, and it's really where I left off with the God delusion, and you talk about the origins of religion and how we have amazing creativity and we're able to imagine things that are logically possible but not proven, and the point that people do need to believe things that they don't have direct evidence for, and that have, I mean, basically...
Okay, so what's the question?
My question is this. It's a biological question and it's a practical question. If 90% of the people on the planet are turning to religion to get through their lives, how do we... because for me it was easy. Once I watched an episode of Cosmos or read a few lines of Mr. Dawkins, book, it was obvious. I didn't have any more questions, but I have a lot of time to spend on this. I'm relatively wealthy compared to most people on the planet. How do we practically get people whose lives are miserable, who are struggling to survive, and who are clinging to life so perilously, to be able to come to a level where they have an understanding, at least basic understanding, of the world we do live in, such that they can make their own decision and don't have to be victims of religion and just slaves to easy reality.
Thank you very much.
Easy story.
And by the way, that was absolutely crystal clear, so I don't know whether the engineers have tweaked something and got that right, but I could hear every word of that. It's funny you should mention 90%. I mean, it's approximately true that in this country, in the United States, 90% of the population does believe in God. If you look, however, at the members of the National Academy of Sciences, who are the elite scientists, or indeed if you look at the equivalent in Britain, or the British Commonwealth, it would be Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, about 90% of the members of the Royal Society are atheist. So it's an exact mirror image of the population at large. Now, your question is, how do we take people who are unfortunate, who are poor, who are suffering, who don't have the advantages that some of us have, how do you wean people off the crutch of religion? Note that it's completely illogical to say that because something is comforting and reassuring and consoling, that makes it true. It's an astonishing fact that many people will say, oh, I believe so-and-so because it would be intolerable if it were not so. I believe so-and-so, I believe in God because I couldn't bear, rather like you said about wanting to live in a universe that has a God in it.
But if he showed up, I'd believe him.
Yeah, sure. People will say, you sometimes hear people say, well, I tried Christianity. That didn't seem quite right to me. I didn't feel right with Christianity, so I tried Buddhism and I tried Hinduism. Who cares what you feel like? Who cares what feels good? Who cares what makes you feel comforted? Who cares what helps you sleep at nights? What matters is what's true.
Okay, let me try and suggest a kinder, gentler response to that in some sense. Although I think it's really important, and it should have been said at one point tonight, and you said it, but I want to make it reiterated. The lesson of science is that the universe doesn't care what you like. And it doesn't care what you want. It is the way it is. And if we could just convince people of that, that would be profound. But I think you've hit it, obviously, a major problem. I think there are two practical potential approaches. One is, many people, you were just in India, and I've lectured in India, for example, and I see these kids. I've never felt more like I was going to be crushed by kids interested in learning, because they realize that if they become scientists or engineers, it's their ticket out of poverty. It's their ticket to improve the quality of life in their country. And so if we can educate people to learn to the point that science can provide a way out of poverty, then I think in the long run we're going to head in the direction away from superstition. The other thing, and I once wrote a piece in Scientific American called "Educate Women, Save the World," and I really mean that. I think if we look at probably the major way to improve society, it is looking at those societies where women are subjugated, and usually because of religion. And if we can educate women, we'll find, first of all, the birth rate will go down, and secondly, that they'll do a much better job of ensuring that their children are educated and improve their quality of life. So one of the areas we don't have much time. I appreciate the applause, but we've talked about this. That one of the areas that I actually think atheists, quote unquote, could, and we're talking about ways of doing this right now, could make an effort is to work against the subjugation of women and which is largely due to religion.
That is so important.
So I hate to return the conversation to science education again, but I feel that, like Jefferson, the democracy and demands informed citizenship, and I'm concerned about the science teachers that you said don't know science. I'm worried that our university model is not one that rewards professors that are communicators. Can you address that? And shouldn't the incentives for people who are knowledgeable in science and engineering and mathematics, who can also communicate, shouldn't those incentives be huge? And why aren't they?
Well, I'll start. Well, I mean, since I like to communicate, I think the incentives should be gigantic. But I think, look, universities and research universities are for two things, and they're for the creation of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge. And both of those things have to be rewarded. And that means dissemination of knowledge in a wide variety of ways, not just communicating, but also going and creating companies to produce technologies that improve society. And you see a lot of professors who have in the past been penalized by, in fact, taking their ideas and commercializing them. I think we need to science and education work best when we reward those people who are talented at whatever they can do. And young people come up to me and say, look, I want to do what you're doing in terms of communication. How can I do it? And I generally tell them, frankly, that if they're scientists, and these are young scientists, that the best thing they can do if they're talented at science is do science. And look for every opportunity to communicate. But the better they are at their science, the more opportunities will arise for them to reach a broader audience. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to, as Richard says, we have to recognize, appreciate, and provide appropriate pay for teachers. It's essential. But not everyone. I've often said this. It's important to me that not every scientist goes out and talks to the public. There are a lot of my colleagues I want to keep away from the public. And so I think you have to balance it. I think you have to reward both.
I think it's also true that until fairly recently, scientists who were good at communicating were not well rewarded. I mean, the notorious case of Carl Sagan, who was obviously a superb communicator and a great scientist as well, as it happened. But he was denied fellowship of the National Academy of Sciences, almost certainly because of jealousy, actually. I mean, because he was popular, because he had a huge following on television and for his books, this actually counted against his election to the National Academy. And I think that's changed. I don't think that would happen anymore.
I mean, it still happens, of course. Jealousy is jealousy, but you're right. I think it has changed, and I think it's changed partly because scientists have recognized, and I know in this country, for example, the death of when the superconducting super collider was killed, my community of scientists realized that one of the reasons was, well, it was our fault. We hadn't communicated why people should be willing to spend money on such seemingly esoteric questions. And I think scientists are realizing more and more, and it's a self-interest, but that's fine, that the health of science requires, and it should require, us to explain to the public why we're doing what we're doing, because the public is funding us. So I think there's more appreciation because of that.
Yeah.
I would just like to tie back to this gentleman's question here, and it was something that I've been wondering for a long time. A lot of people have been asserting that we are heading away from Darwinism. We are de-evolving. Those people that you see around you are educated. Those who have degrees in bachelor's, master's above are having 1 to every 3 children. So we educate women, we bring their birth rate down. How and what implications is this going to have on our society as those who are more educated and who are expanding their horizons are having less and less children and having less and less effect on those who are having more children? I just had an argument with somebody who told me the Earth is 6,000 years old and science is a conspiracy theory. I had nothing.
Okay. Do you want to touch that?
Really
I think the point, as I understood it, was that if we dissuade people from having children, then the people who don't have children are going to take over the world. I mean, the people who do have children are going to take over the world, and I think that in fact that's been the policy of a number of religions. The Orthodox Jews, Catholics, Muslims on the whole. That point is to take over the world by breeding, and And I think the answer is that my own sense is that, first of all, when people tell me, you know, I'm educated and therefore, and I'm wealthy and therefore I should have more children because I can do it. It just seems to me to be an incredibly effete attitude. That they have a right and that they have a right, and somehow they can give a greater gift to the future by having children than anyone else. The wonderful thing about genetics, as far as I can see, is that from a slum in India, you can get one of the greatest mathematicians in the world, and so I just take that argument that the people who know something should have more kids as just ludicrous. Just ludicrous.
Dr. Kraus, I think your book is speaking to ultimately the answer to my question, but I'm going to ask my question anyway. So we know that the universe was created from the Big Bang. My question is, what created the Big Bang? Where did the stuff that created the Big Bang come from?
Well, I would say read my book, but more importantly, buy my book.
I'm going to.
But in any case, what is? Let me just give a 1-minute answer because it's a long. What is remarkable is that you know, to create stuff, it sounds like you need stuff, and to create stuff, and the conservation of energy, you would think, and this is where the argument's often used, conservation of energy means you can't start with nothing and have a universe with something. But what is amazing is when you add gravity into the mix, a miracle occurs, but a natural miracle. That gravity allows negative energy as well as positive energy configurations. And you can create, for example, 2 particles out of nothing. Now, they have energy because of their rest mass. But if the gravitational field they're in is strong enough, the gravitational potential energy attracting them together is so strong and negative that the sum total of those 2 bits of energy can be precisely 0. And you can create those particles with impunity. And in fact, that happens, we think, near black holes, and in fact, it will happen in empty space. And so, in fact, to create stuff, you don't need stuff, you just need nothing, and in this case, quantum mechanics. That's the short version, but the long and much clearer version is in the book.
Thank you so much for both of you for coming. I have a question for Professor Dawkins about the role of the humanities in human affairs. You've spoken with great eloquence and persuasiveness about the value of science, and with equal eloquence and persuasiveness about the lack of value of religion. Where do you see the humanities?
By humanities, you would mean
literature, history,
study
philosophy.
of history, literature, languages, arts. I mean, immensely valuable. Some of the crowning achievements of the human species lie in the humanities. I see no problem with that at all. I'm proud to be a member of the same species as Shakespeare and Beethoven and Michelangelo. So I have no quarrel with anybody who wants to make a career out of the humanities and who wants to study them, a professor of history, professor of literature. These seem to me to be the right sort of things to be going on in a university and in a culture. I would accept, E-X-C-E-P-T, I would accept theology from that. Because theology, it seems to me, unlike those other humanities that you mentioned, is not a subject at all.
Yeah. It's an embarrassment. I agree.
Yeah.
As
Jefferson said, a professor of divinity has no place in our university.
And he created a university, exactly. And I agree with you 100%. I put out a challenge, and maybe some people here can try and match it. I've challenged theologians to give me a single example of a contribution to human knowledge that theology has provided in the last 500 years. And when I talk to major theologians, and I do, believe it or not, the answer I always get is, what do you mean by knowledge? And I point out, if I talk to a biologist or a historian or a psychologist, I get concrete answers, but they give me this epistemological... Anyway. Okay.
But I do think we need to add to that professors of theology often do extremely worthwhile things. Biblical history, biblical literary criticism, archaeology of Palestine. These are all thoroughly reputable and good things. When I said theology is not a subject at all, I meant things like the theology of the transubstantiation of the Trinity, etc. That's not a subject at all. But of course, many people who are professors of theology don't do that sort of nonsense. They do proper academic studies of biblical history and literature and so on.
And one last thing, I knew you asked Richard, but I'll jump in. I think that the thing that's really important to point out is there isn't a dichotomy between science and the humanities. They all do the same thing. They all give us a different perspective of our place in the cosmos. A good play does, a good piece of music, and so does science. And so they're all different parts of the same thing, in my opinion. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and for taking my question. I was wondering about politics and religion. In a country where we have separation of church and state, why do we think it's okay to allow the policymakers and the politicians to use religious reasoning to guide legislation? So in something like stem cells or gay marriage, where the opponents of it will give a religious reason against it, doesn't that fly in the face of separation of church and state?
Of course it does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we have a society where, the sad thing that Richard's pointed out, we have a society where we tolerate that. It seems acceptable. And people who bring up the problem are viewed as being strident or shrill. And an example which I created a few years ago, a group called Science Debate 2008, and now it's Science Debate 2012. We're trying to create a debate among the presidential candidates on issues of science and technology which are actually relevant to the governance of. But when we tried, in fact, we came very close in 2008, but the candidates decided instead to have a debate on faith, which of course is completely irrelevant to anything that's going to matter because they're all people of faith. But I think we need journalists to have the courage to point that out, and we need the journalists to be able to do that and still have papers that sell copies, and that's the hard part, I think. Maybe, I guess we're going to ask one more question, the last question.
I'm the lucky one, thank you. I suppose, Dr. Dawkins, I would ask this to you. Is there a scientific basis for the concept of free will in human beings? And if not, is there a biological evolutionary reason why all of us believe we have free will?
The late Christopher Hitchens, when asked, does he believe in free will, replied, I have no choice. It's a question that I dread, actually, because I don't have a very well thought out view about it. I think that, I have a materialist view of the world. I think that things are determined in a rational way by antecedent events. And so that commits me to the view that when I think I have free will, when I think that I'm exercising free choice, I'm deluding myself, that my brain states are determined by physical events, and yet that seems to contradict, to go against the very powerful subjective impression that we all have, that we do have free will. I think all I can do is recommend the works of my colleague Daniel Dennett on the subject, which are fascinating.
And there's a new book by another one of our colleagues, Sam Harris, on free will that's coming out. But
yes.
But I also have to agree that I think everything I know about the world tells me that there's no such thing as free will. I just think we act, but the world behaves as if there's free will, and so it doesn't make much difference. Just like the particles in the room, we can discuss them statistically, and they behave as if they can do things that they're not being forced to do. It's just statistics. And we behave as if we have free will because we live in a very complex world where there's so many factors influencing any of our decisions that you can't trace that free will down to its source. And so the difference between a world where we act as if we have free will or it looks like we have free will and we really do, in my mind, is so minimal that it's a question for philosophers to worry about, but not me. And maybe with that, we'll thank you very much. Thank you.